requirement for strong mass elite policy linkages is not met in several Western European democracies. And so I'm guessing what we were able to do in this case was to say, here's one of the, because null findings can be hard to present, this null finding, if the world is null in this way, then that is really, really important. And at least this particular set of reviewers, enough of them bought it. Not the one who said the paper should never have been written and never should be published, but the other ones were willing enough to buy it to support publication of the paper. Incidentally, one thing I've sort of skipped just because I can't cover every every point about publishing these papers. Almost every paper I've published in one of these, like the Journal of Politics and the American Journal of Political Science, as all of you know, you don't just send it in, and they don't just send back a letter saying, good, we're going to publish it essentially as it is. There's always a revise and resubmit. Almost every paper for a field-wide journal I've ever written, and these two in particular, when we revised and resubmitted the paper, we send along a dramatically revised paper and a 20-page single-spaced memo to go along with it, dealing point by point with every single reservation that the reviewer expressed. And I should note that I always do that on papers I write with graduate students, just because I know how crucial it is for graduate students to get publications. In the papers I do with my co-authors Sam Merrill and Bernie Grothman, who have both been professors for decades, if we don't agree with the reviewer, sometimes we'll say, we're not going to change it. We think the reviewer's wrong, we're standing our ground, and if an editor, you have to decide, therefore, if maybe you should reject the paper. But with graduate students, I feel an obligation that it's so important to their career to get it published that I'm willing to be a lot more flexible. So one reason we got these papers accepted, quite frankly, is every major comment. We would start by quoting the comment, and then we'd write 2 or 3 paragraphs responding. Either, you're right, and here's what we've changed. Or you raised this possible problem, we checked, and this problem doesn't exist. Or it does exist, and here's what we did to fix it. So I don't want to give you the impression that, again, it was smooth sailing here. Getting papers published in field-wide journals in particular is a very arduous process. Jeff, I think you and I talked about this last night, that I feel like I spend only 10% of my time doing new research. I spend about 40% of my time teaching and writing reports and doing administrative things, and I spend another 40 to 50% revising and resubmitting articles. Because particularly getting them published in tough journals, the bar is so high now that you have to jump through a million hoops to actually get this, to get these things accepted. So that was my second phase of research, and as I said, I was very displeased. I don't want a world in which when parties shift their positions, voters don't notice. I think it's a bad world to live in. It's a very bad world in which to do spatial modeling. And I don't want the world to be like that. So I had to decide what to do with this horrendous finding that we had. Let me say a few words about this finding. And let me ask the question again, do I believe it? Do I believe that we really live in a world where in most of the advanced Western democracies, when parties change their positions, voters don't really notice? I'll give a similar sort of response that I did when I posed that rhetorical question about whether parties' vote shares changed when they shifted. Before I did this research, I would have said, that's crazy. Of course voters notice, or at least a lot of voters notice a lot of the time. I'm not so sure now, and I think there's a chance that we're right. And I think there's a good enough chance that I was willing and happy to publish the paper on the theory, let's get the research out there and let's let other people replicate our findings on new countries or new data sets or new something, or tell us that we've done something wrong. But if we are right, why are we right? And I've spent the last couple of years just brooding about that question. Let me talk about British politics as kind of a nice example. After Michael Foot, under Michael Foot's leadership, if you can call it that, resulting in a horrendous result for the Labour Party in 1983, Neil Kinnock spent most of the next 10 years trying to convince the British public, you know what, we're sensible. You can trust us. We're not radically left-wing. We really are moderate. And as I'll show you in some data a little bit later on, he did have some success in doing this, but he didn't have all that much. And you know why? One of the reasons was that every time Neil Kinnock said, look at us, we're not like we were under Michael Foot, we're moderate, you can trust us, Margaret Thatcher was right there saying, don't you believe it, you know what you've seen Labour be like before, don't you believe these moderate words. And a phrase that she used over and over that, at least reading it on the page, sounds devastatingly effective to me, is she would say, you know, the socialism of the Labour Party is like an iceberg. 90% of it is below the surface. And so the idea is, don't listen to what they say. You can't infer their policy positions based on what you say. They say, no matter what they say, it's the same old people and the same old Labour. And to many British voters, at least my impression is that was a very effective counter-argument. And so the point here is that, you know, an individual party or its elites can't completely control their own message. They can say what they have to say, they can't control how the media interprets it, and they can't stop the opposition from questioning and calling their policy promises into question. I'll give you another example of another leader who couldn't change the party's image in the way he wanted to, and that was John Major. I don't know how many of you have read John Major's autobiography, but if you read the part where he was prime minister between 1992 and 1997, it's one long scream of pain. And the reason that it is, as you know, during this period, the Conservative Party essentially self-destructed with, you know, divisions and things that made them look horrifically incompetent and horrifically sleazy and dishonest. Well, every fifth page in Major's autobiography during this, describing this time period, goes the same way. So then I was ready to announce a major new policy initiative to rebrand the Conservative Party, but the day before, one of our members of Parliament was caught taking a bribe. Or in one case, the day before, one of our members of Parliament hung himself. Or something else. And the point, and then he talked about this, and I couldn't get my message out, and I couldn't get my message out. And by about 1996, he's complaining that even when he could give a speech, the media didn't report on the speech. They were just busy making fun of him. They no longer took him seriously. Well, try to control your policy image under those circumstances. And the point is that there are many, perhaps in a majority of situations, when you either have a leader who is at the head of a completely fractured party, or a leader who lacks charisma. Think of William Hague, who in many ways was an admirable man and did many things to rebuild the Conservative Party, but he wasn't very compelling to watch on television. So what I've come to believe is that it's much harder than I had previously realized to get your message out and to control your own policy message. The last sort of qualitative story I'll tell about this is I'm also reading Alistair Campbell's diaries right now. Since you're both arrived in the country just a little while ago, he was essentially Tony Blair's person who dealt with the media for Tony Blair's image maker from 1994 for about the next 9 years. So in his diary, he's always talking about Tony Blair. It's very funny, the things that Tony Blair was a lot more hysterical behind the scenes than he was when he was on camera. He was always running around, this speech is never going to work, you know, it's going to be a bomb, it's going to go awful, and then it went well. But one of the things that Tony Blair comes up over and over is the following. You know, Tony Blair, as you know, rebranded Labour as New Labour, and he did manage to convince voters that New Labour was really different, more moderate and more responsive. But in the book, or in Alistair Campbell's diaries, about once every 3 weeks, something happens that drives Tony Blair absolutely berserk. Some member of a trade union, like a high-ranking leader, will be quoted as saying, well, you know, don't you worry, we're going to talk to Tony Blair about this. Or Tony Blair will get angry and say, how come you've scheduled for me to meet with all these these well-known left-wing politicians in a very public forum? And Tony Blair is always saying, we can't do this. One slip, one mistake, and no one will believe that Labour has really changed. They'll think we're the same old Labour Party. So Tony Blair was obsessed with a consistent image. And he was the rare example, in my opinion, of someone who really did control his party's image. Partly, note, because he was rebranding Labour at a time when the Conservatives were at low ebb, when they were so mired in sleaze and intra-party divisions and so on, that John Major and subsequently William Hague weren't able to effectively call labor's policy sincerity into question because they were too busy dealing with their own problems. Well, that's sort of a long way of saying, I do believe now, or I've come to believe, you know, we shouldn't just assume, we shouldn't talk casually about, oh, well, all that a party needs to do is shift to the left or shift to the right, as though they can actually snap their fingers and do it and convince voters that they really are. And to that extent, I do wonder a little bit about whether parties can actually shift their image. You know, I have one last strand of research I can talk about, but I don't, you know, you may be sort of getting into research fatigue at this point, where I don't know whether it's best for me to talk a little more about my own research or to take some questions from all of you about whatever you'd like to talk about, or if I should go on for a little while longer about sort of the current research I'm working on. Whatever works best for any of you.
Yeah, do you want to stop for some questions? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure.
We'll try that.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. You have investigated this for quite long period now, you know, so
yeah,
how citizens react to changing policy, the party's position, but the point is, I wonder if you did consider at all actually to do it the other way around, to look for the determinants of
the party's positions.
Yes.
Yeah, I've done that, and in fact, I've written many papers about that. I didn't talk about those here because I wanted to sort of keep it on one theme, but well, I'll just summarize for you some of the findings and mention some of these papers in case you're interested. I have a couple of papers written with Lawrence Esroe and Michael Clark and someone else named Derek Glasgow. One came out in the British Journal of Political Science in 2004, the other in the American Journal of Political Science in 2006, where we looked at the question, when public opinion shifts to the left or the right, do parties react by shifting their own positions? And I have another paper that came out in Comparative Political Studies a year or two ago about that too. And I won't list all the papers, but let me just tell you briefly what we found, or what the patterns that we see. What we do see, first of all, is that there is a tendency that when public opinion shifts to the left or the right, then centrist and right-wing parties tend to respond to shifts in public opinion by shifting their policy platforms in the same direction. Or that's the substantive interpretation we give to the data analysis we have. Basically, when the left-right self-placements of citizens in a country move in a particular direction, what we see is that the comparative manifesto project codings of the party's positions tend to shift in the same direction, either contemporaneously or with a lag in responding to public opinion. We find that left-wing parties don't tend to respond to public opinion to the same extent. Now, as to why that's the case, I don't really know. We make some guesses in the research that we've done. Our one guess, and this goes back to a book by Przeworski and Sprague, a famous book from the 1980s called Paper Stones, is that left-wing parties, in particular communist parties, but some socialist parties too, sort of see themselves as trying to change society and fundamentally sort of alter the way society works. And therefore, they tend to try to stick to their positions and convince the voters to change their minds and come to them, as opposed to shifting their own positions in response to voters. As I said, centrist and right-wing parties show a stronger tendency to respond to public opinion. We also have a paper, this is again Zeynep Somer-Topko and I, that came out, it was either a year or two ago in the British Journal of Political Science, that suggested that parties respond to each other. That and the evidence we showed is that if you looked at all the parties, if you had one focal party, and you looked at all the other parties in the system, if they tended to shift, let's say, to the left last time, then the focal party tends to shift to the left at the next election. We also had additional research that suggested that parties are particularly responsive to what we call their ideological neighbors. So communist parties respond more to socialist parties than they do to Christian democratic parties and so on. We also have some research suggesting the parties respond to what happened in the last election. Although the relationship there is kind of complicated, and probably the best research on this is actually by Zeynep Samartoglu by herself. She has some research suggesting that if what you did last time didn't work, you shifted to the left and your vote share went down, for example, then if another election happens within the next 2 or 3 years, you do the opposite. And similarly, if what you did last time worked, you shifted to the left and your vote share increased. Then if the election is within the next 2 or 3 years, you do the same thing and shift farther to the left. But that if the next election isn't until 4 or 5 years later, then you don't tend to react to what happened last time, perhaps because you don't think it's relevant any longer. So yeah, I've written a lot of papers about that. Parties do seem to respond to public opinion to a limited extent to past election results, and they do seem to respond to each other as well. Yeah.
When you talk about the policy shifts, right, you mostly, or almost always refer to left-right.
Right.
So I was thinking, have you ever used another spectrum, like in European context of pro and anti-integration, for example?
Funny you should ask, because that's one of my next projects. They're talking about this research here, which suggests that when parties shift their positions on left-right, voters don't seem to notice. One possible objection is, well, perhaps left-right is just too diffuse a dimension. Voters perhaps have a good feel for dimensions about crime or taxes or European integration, and we get a different result if we look at that. So, once again, Lawrence and Zeynep and I have a paper proposal into the Midwest where what we're going to do is look at shifts in parties' positions on European integration based on their Euro manifestos. And one of the advantages there is we have data on whether voters, where the voters place the party. Remember I mentioned before that one sort of problem of interpretation we run into here is if we don't find a relationship, is it because voters didn't notice, or because these codings of how left or right or pro and anti-European the parties are riddled with measurement error? Well, the nice thing about the European integration issue is there's a data set put together by people at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where they asked a bunch of experts in various countries at various points, where do you place the parties on European integration? So we can not only calibrate shifts in voters' perceptions of the parties' positions against the codings of the parties' manifestos, but also against the experts' perceptions of whether the parties have shifted as well. So that's our next project. So from your question, it sounds like there may be some interest in this one.
Sure, certainly looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks.
Justus.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very interesting research. Well, I have two questions I had in mind here. Is first of all, to what extent, when you went into perceived party positions by voters, did you also look at heterogeneity among these voters? Like, for example, more extremist, more policy-minded voters, or perhaps knowledgeable, more interested voters?
Yes, we did. And as a little bit of background, let me sort of further one of my answers to a question that was asked just a moment ago. I was asked, when do parties shift their policies? And I said that they responded to shifts in public opinion, or at least centrist and right-wing parties did. One other piece of research that just slipped my mind, and this is another paper with Lawrence Esro that came out in the Journal of Politics either last year or the year before, was titled, Who Do European Parties Represent? And what we found in that paper is that European parties of the center and the right tended to respond to shifts in public opinion, but they responded disproportionately to a group that we labeled opinion leaders. And those were people in the surveys who reported, A, that they frequently discussed politics with other people, and also that they tried to change other people's minds about politics. And in fact, what our research suggested was that European parties responded very sharply to this. When this group of voters changed their left-right orientation, political parties shifted their positions in the same way. Parties didn't respond much at all to other voters, the ones who weren't opinion leaders. So to get back to answer your question, we checked to see whether opinion leaders, whether when parties shifted their positions, did opinion leaders perhaps notice this policy shift, even if the rest of the population didn't. And we didn't find any such effect. Now my recollection is, and I could be wrong about this, one thing I should mention is, whenever we write these papers, we check out a million things. And frankly, sometimes I forget what we checked out. But I believe we also checked out whether citizens who had higher levels of political knowledge, and this was based on these political knowledge quizzes that are included in some of these national election studies, did they disproportionately notice parties' policy shifts? And the answer, once again, was no. They didn't. So the findings seem to be that voters in general just didn't notice, and you couldn't locate a particular sub-constituency that did seem to notice what the parties were saying.
Maybe following up on that, also on that particular piece of research, I was just wondering your explanation for that nobody seems to be listening. Is basically, or one of the explanations could be partly that, basically party leaders kind of control the message. There's so many messages sent out by the party.
Yeah.
It might be fuzzy, right? The story of Kinnock, the story of Major. Well, that suggests a little bit that sometimes it works. So sometimes there should be some results.
Yes.
So in other words, it could be that, or another possibility is that sometimes it works, but perhaps in the longer run it works.
Yeah, you know.
Not succeed, but
right. And I agree with you about that. Maybe, in fact, I will talk brief for about 3 or 4 minutes about my new research project, which is exactly about this. So what I summarized my research before was to say that when parties shifted their position, nobody noticed. But you may recall at one point I did say there was an exception, that British voters noticed when Tony Blair shifted his position. So a new strand of research I'm working on now, and I think this may address your question, is, okay, we found that in most countries, most of the time, voters don't notice. What I'm doing in a couple of new projects, looking at Britain and the Netherlands in the 1980s and the 1990s, is selecting on the dependent variable. I'm looking at 2 cases where voters actually noticed when parties shifted their policy positions in order to answer the question, okay, in those possibly rare questions, when voters do notice what parties are saying, then how do voters react? And let me actually just very briefly, I'll present you some of this data from Britain, which suggests that in Britain, post-Thatcher, voters have noticed that the parties have come together. Despite what I said about Major and about Hague, you will say that they've noticed something about the Conservatives. And I'll also present some aggregate level data that suggests that voters have reacted, when they voters do notice, they do in fact react. Here we go. Yeah, okay, so this is where I just mentioned that survey data suggests that the British public post-Thatcher perceived elite policy convergence. And there's a paper here that's forthcoming with Jane Green, who some of you may know. She's a professor at the Manchester University. Caitlin Milazzo is a graduate student at UC Davis. And we have a forthcoming paper in comparative political studies. I have another paper with Catherine de Vries from your university, I believe they're in Amsterdam, that's now basically conditionally accepted as forthcoming in the British Journal of Political Science, that shows that the Dutch public noticed the policy convergence of Labour and the Christian Democrats during the 1980s and the 1990s, and that they reacted to that. But for right now, I'll present the British data because that's what I loaded up here. So what we did is, this is, for all of you here in Britain, I hardly need to present this, but what we did is we looked at a series of policy scale questions that were included in all the British election studies between 1987 and 2001. Here's one example about equalization of incomes. I won't read the question out, but in case, I don't know how well you can see it there in Amsterdam, but it's asking voters for their opinion about whether the government should make greater efforts to make people's incomes more equal, or whether the government should be less concerned about how equal people's incomes are. We looked at this issue scale and 3 others relating to nationalization of industry, to the trade-offs between unemployment versus inflation, and to the trade-offs between raising taxes and spending more on social services versus cutting taxes and spending less on social services. One thing to note for when I go to the next table is on all of these were scales running from 1 to 11. Higher numbers indicate sort of more conservative responses or ones that are more associated with the right wing. So let me show you where the British public on average placed the Labour and Conservative parties on these 4 scales between 1987 and 2001, and you'll see fairly dramatic changes. This is probably self-explanatory, but say the upper left-hand number there, 3.03 for the social services scale in 1987, means on average the British respondents to this survey placed Labour at about 3 on this 1 to 11 scale, the Conservatives at about 7, so that the gap between the two parties, the measure of the policy differences that voters perceived, was about 4 points. And note that in 1987, there's a large perceived gap on every one of these scales, 4 points, 6 points, 4 points, 5.5 points. On average, voters placed the two parties about 5 points apart on a 1 to 11 scale, which is a really considerable difference. Incidentally, 1 point, just in case you're wondering why this time period, prior to 1987, the endpoints of the scales change, and so does the question wording. Starting in 2005, to the chagrin of many of us, these policy scales were no longer included in the British election study. So we have to stop in 2001. Well, anyway...
Because they don't want you to disprove anything.
Who can prove them wrong? Yeah. So the point to note here is that in Britain, voters noticed dramatic policy convergence between the Labour and Conservative parties over time. So this is the one except, or I should say, I'm sorry, the Netherlands is another exception. These are the only 2 exceptions we found to this general rule that when parties shift, voters don't seem to notice. Let me next show you, and so this just shows, okay, voters noticed. So now the $64,000 question, so do they react? Well, how might they react? Well, the data I'm about to show you is a display of the mean position of all people who supported the Labour Party versus the mean policy position of all people who supported the Conservative Party. This chart suggests that voters perceive the Labour and Conservative Party elites agree with each other more now than they used to. This next chart is going to strongly suggest that among rank-and-file voters, Labourites and Conservatives agree with each other on policy a lot more now than they used to. Here's the next chart. And again, the all categories, the mean response over all election respondents. Lab partisans is the mean response of all people who said that they identified with the Labour Party based on this question. Generally, do you feel close to one of these parties in a list or not to any party? And the mean self-placement of Conservative partisans. The Labour-Conservative gap is, once again, sort of how the difference between the average views of Labour partisans and Conservative partisans. Well, the social services trend is not very strong, but look at the trends on the other 3 issues. On nationalization of industry, the partisans of the 2 different parties were separated by about 3.5 points in 1987, down to a little bit more than 1.5 points by 2001. You see a narrowing on all 4 issues. The average gap between the partisans of the 2 parties is cut nearly in half over time. Now, I'm not going to tell you that pattern proves that voters are reacting to parties, but that pattern is certainly consistent with the world in which voters are reacting to parties. In particular, if voters updated their partisanship based on the party's new policy positions, you would see a pattern like this. Similarly, if voters didn't change their partisanship, but instead took their policy cues from parties, so that longtime Labour partisans listened to Tony Blair and said, you know what, he's right. You know, more moderate policies are better. I'll switch my policy positions. Then you would also expect to see a pattern like this. So this provides evidence, we feel at least, that is consistent with a story in which voters are reacting to partisans. The last point I'll make about this new research I'm doing is, note that while I've just told you that this aggregate level pattern is consistent with a story where voters react to partisans, where voters react to parties, it doesn't prove it. It's also consistent with a story where the parties were reacting to the voters, and it's also consistent with a story where both the parties and the voters were reacting to some external factor. And the next strand of research I'm working on, which I won't tell you about, at least right now, because it's very technical and it might be better just for me to take questions, is going from these aggregate level patterns to trying to parse out the individual level process that's going on. I will tell you